Okay, well, just make sure this works first. Yeah. My name's Ryan, as you all know. So as a psychology major, I figured it would be fitting to do something with the brain. So my presentation is on cognitive enhancement and the future, a post-learning world. So when you're born, each of us has close to 100 billion neurons. Each of these neurons are able to connect up to 10,000 other neurons. So it's been hypothesized that the minimum number of connections in each of our brains is at least 100 trillion. So as we grow and learn, these synapses, these connections, ones that are useful to us are strengthened through their use, and ones that are not strengthened and kind of reallocated for better use. Despite this massive complexity that our brains have, they show an equally massive amount of resiliency. So this is a process called a hemispherectomy. So basically you have patients who have severe seizures with their epicenter being in one hemisphere of the brain. And as these seizures progress and get worse and worse with age, they begin to spread. They'll cross the corpus callosum and start to affect the other half of the brain as well. So surgeries called split brain remove the corpus callosum, the connection between the two hemispheres. But sometimes they seem not to help much. There are other connections that these seizures can work their way through into the other hemisphere. So in hemispherectomies, an entire half, other than the cerebellum and brainstem, is removed completely. So in these cases, you'd think you'd see large intellectual impairments in these patients, but in a follow-up study by Devlin and colleagues in 2003, they looked at, I think it was close to 28 children in the US who had had hemispherectomies. And they followed up 2 years later to find that a vast majority of these patients had normal intellectual function, normal IQ, normal social skills, with only about 5% showing any sort of intellectual deficit. On the other end of that spectrum, I think it was 8% of these patients also showed like vast jumps in IQ, more intelligent. There was one case of a man who, at 5 years old, had a hemispherectomy and moved on to go to an Ivy League school, graduate top of his class. He's a Wall Street executive now. So this is called plasticity, the brain's, as we've talked about, ability to change and adapt to its environment, what it's given. So this shows that obviously the brain, you would like to have the whole, but can function just as well, missing large portions. So that brings us to intelligence. We've talked about intelligence many times in this class. And when you Google it, you find this definition: the ability to acquire, imply knowledge and skills. Cognition, same thing. When you Google cognition, you find the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding it through thought, experience, and the senses. So these two things are obviously tied quite tightly, with cognition being kind of the mode through which we use our intelligence, our acquired skills and knowledge. So throughout time, this aspect of intelligence has been defined differently. You had, like in ancient times, you had hunter-gatherers. So whoever hunted the best could build the best shelter. Those were the people that thrived. Whereas now, you wake up every morning and you go to school. Every day, as you grow from a child to here, where we are now, or even further, if you decide to keep going with your education, is more or less a competition to see who is the most intelligent. Those being more intelligent usually reaping more benefits. So despite this definition or what's important about intelligent changing. The idea that this intelligence can somehow be maximized has not changed. So looking back as far as 5,000 years, the Indian practice of Ayurveda, I'm not really sure how to pronounce it, and traditional Chinese medicines all had their own kind of branches that dealt specifically with enhancing the mind. In the Indian practice, a big part of it was herbs, like such as rosemary was used for, it was believed to enhance memory, so it was drank in teas. Whereas in traditional Chinese medicine, it was more related to massage. Acupuncture was a big thing, as Chinese medicine focuses on a flow of qi. And it was believed that through acupuncture and massage, this flow of qi could be improved to the mind. It's kind of final ending spot. And through that, individuals were able to live better lives, be more efficient with things. In a more recent area of cognitive enhancement, there were accounts in the Second World War by British, Soviet, and French soldiers that the Nazi forces had this unbelievable ability to fight for days without tire, stay sharp. And it was a big part of Nazi Germany's ability to take large portions of Europe so quickly. So upon the capture of a few Nazi soldiers, the British found this drug, Pervitin. And they analyzed it, they synthesized it by themselves, figured it out, and it turned out to be, actually, it's very close in chemical makeup to crystal meth. But it's an amphetamine compound that boosts focus, decreases fatigue, and these Nazi soldiers were using it immensely throughout the war. Some of them becoming terribly addicted. And when supplies ran out and soldiers didn't have any more, especially in Soviet Russia, it led to, in big part, their downfall and their loss of that war. So cognitive enhancement today, I'm sure you guys have all seen or heard about Adderall or Dexedrine or Concerta. It's a growing trend in workplaces, universities, to use these amphetamine-based stimulants off-label. They seem to provide users with prolonged focus, the ability to stay awake for hours on end and not break from your studying, or in the workplace do copious amounts of work in half the time it would take your colleague who wasn't using it. So in a study in 2014, these researchers, by way of self-report survey, found the prevalence of this off-label amphetamine use in US grad students to be as high as 17.5%. With the nature of self-report surveys, you're obviously going to have people who aren't willing to disclose that they're illegally using a prescription substance. So it's quite likely that that number is higher. So like I said, these drugs offer the user the ability to focus for long periods of time. And studies in both animals and humans have shown that in basic memory tasks, while the subject is learning the task, under the fluence of these amphetamine stimulants, they have been showed in the recall portions of the task to do better than controls not using the substance or given a placebo. So what are issues with using drugs right now for cognitive enhancement? First of all, obviously, off-label use of these is illegal. It doesn't seem to stop many people. But it seems pretty easy. I know multiple friends who have gone and gotten their prescription and then sell half of it every time they refill it. Obviously, if you're using these heavily, you're going to develop tolerances. You're going to have to take more to get your desired effect. And increasing your dose always has the possibility of leading to dependence. Are you going to be able to get off when you're done school? Or are you going to need to continue using this drug to function normally? Biological symptoms, liver toxicity, damage to brain areas, just normal things that come along with use of any drug. And then there's the enormous amount of time and money associated with bringing a drug to market. It often takes close to 15 years, hundreds of millions of dollars. And the funding for things like this and the availability are often only for treatment of disorders. You'd be hard pressed to find, at least in developed countries, regulations that would allow you to use an amphetamine drug for human enhancement legally. So what's the next step if drugs aren't the way to go? First, you have to consider what kind of world we're looking at. While I'm skeptical that the technological singularity will happen, I do believe that we are going to approach that type of world. So in the possibility that that did happen, it would seem that there would not be much use for human cognitive enhancement. We would have machines, computers, developing faster than we were, fixing problems faster than we are. So there wouldn't be a big market for improving ourselves. But in a world approaching a singularity where we are still in control, we are making decisions, a high precedence may be placed on improving the mind, maximizing its potential. So another question you have to ask is, what are we trying to do? When you think about cognition and you think about intelligence, none of it is possible without learning. Learning is probably the biggest dimension of these two things. When you look at an expert of any domain, like Gary or Dr. Solez or anyone else who's lectured in this course, they're experts because they've devoted large amounts of time and effort into learning the relevant information to their field and experiencing how to use it in the correct way. But what if we could accelerate this process or eliminate it altogether? So this process of learning, like I talked about before, arises from plasticity. And plasticity is more or less the potentiation of a synapse. So say you're learning a fact in a sociology class. A synapse will be used to remember that information, or obviously a multitude of synapses. But what this chain of synapses for this specific information will do is the more you think about it, the more you use this information, the more these synapses are used. And when a synapse is used, things like receptor density at the points of synapse are upregulated, and this leads to potentiation of that synapse, meaning a lower amount of input power, such as an action potential to that synapse, is required for a maximum output. So the more you become familiar with things, the less you need to consciously think about them to bring all your knowledge of that subject to mind. And this is the basis of memory. So the big thing I focused on with my presentation is this concept of transcranial direct current stimulation, or TDCS. And what this is a non-invasive method where the user is fitted with an electrode cap and current is run through the scalp and into specific loci in the brain. Now what this does is, as we were talking before, there's electrical activity that obviously goes on during any conscious program, any conscious thinking, or unconscious thinking for that matter. So what this process does is helps you potentiate these synapses faster. Extra electrical activity is sent into these areas that are being targeted. And the idea is that this electrical activity helps these synapses become strengthened and reinforced faster. So initially this technology was used in stroke and paralysis patients to help them regain motor skills, whether it's movement of fingers after a stroke, or people who are not completely paralyzed, helping them regain some resemblance of walking again. But recently this private firm, HRL Laboratories, built some interest in how this process would work in neurologically intact patients, normal people, and what it could do for us. So in this experiment that they ran, they took expert pilots, commercial airline pilots, and ran them through a flight simulator multiple times, multiple different pilots doing multiple different activities in the simulator. They measured the alpha and theta waves that came from these pilots' brains by measure of EEG and a few other neuroimaging techniques, and compiled this data, and it basically gave them a picture of what the electrical activity in the brain looks like while they're doing these tasks. So what they did next is using this direct current stimulation, fitted novice pilots who were new to the simulations that the experts had run with electrode caps, and stimulated brain areas that were activated when the expert pilots were doing these tasks. So as they gave these inputs, they also measured the alpha and theta waves coming out of these novice pilot brains. And they tweaked their inputs until the alpha and theta waves matched those of the expert pilots. So they did this over a course of 4 days while these novices did the same simulations as the experts. And what they found with this is that these novice pilots who were given the real TCDS treatment, or TDCS, sorry, became consistent with their newly learned skills 33% faster than those that were given a sham program. So these results are interesting for a number of reasons. 33% is a very significant jump in learning time. And despite the complexity of the brain, hundreds of billions of synapses, and also the individual variance between two people's brains, no one brain is the same, they were able to consistently teach these novice pilots faster. So there were some limitations, obviously, to using this in the future. Obviously, to gain the sort of neural blueprints, you're still going to need experts who are conventionally trained. As well, at this point, the technology only works in conjunction while the learner is actively learning. It's not like you can sit down and plug in and learn what you want to learn, but what if it was that way? So a tech such as this, where it was no longer needed to be used in conjunction with conventional training, would change the world completely. If you were able to sit down, such as Neo in the Matrix, and learn Kung Fu in 3 minutes, there's no limit to what you could do. When you wouldn't have to spend 30 or 40 years to become an expert in a field. So as this tech may or may not progress, one big thing that people hypothesize is that it will somehow become on board. It will be some sort of brain-computer interface implanted into the brain, and it will give you real-time information only when you need it. So this would obviously have huge implications. You could encounter any situation in life and you would instantly have the ability to know everything there is to know about it. So if this technology were to arise, there's obviously a ton of positive applications. To become a lawyer or a doctor would take exponentially less time. And most likely would be exponentially cheaper than, paying a multitude of instructors, student benefits, things like that. You would go to school, sit down for an hour or two a week, and in 5 months, maybe you're a doctor. As well as in developing countries, if this tech can, if the cost can be lowered, these systems are quite simple actually. So they could have huge implications for developing countries where teacher shortages, things like that plague. But as anything that comes with large benefit, you could also see large risk. So if this technology were to be commercially available and fall into the wrong hands, you could do things like training a militia in weeks to be experts in combat. Or say you downloaded a program to become a biochemist and then the next day you became an engineer. This would have massive implications for the ability to, say, build a nuclear bomb or a biological weapon. So how would we handle these sorts of risks and benefits? If this tech were to arise, it would obviously change everything. One big question would who would be able to use it and who would be able to distribute it. Can you buy it at home or buy it at the store and bring it home and simply download and pay for a program and you're a doctor now? Or should it be something where an institution like a university owns the means and you need to come pay the university like you would for getting a degree, but instead of coming to class and learning, you sit and this information is transmitted into your brain. So how it's regulated is going to be a huge, or would be in its possibility, a huge hurdle to overcome, as well as access in developing countries. As with any new tech, it's most likely going to be restricted at the beginning to the first world. So what are the ethical questions that surround that? And will it ever be available in a developing world? So what would this world look like? The formal education system gone, job training, learning skills for fun, gone. And while that seems great, the ability to learn a vast amount of information without any real effort, at what cost would this come to us? So that cost would be personal experience, as we've talked about a few times in the class. Just as knowledge and skills that we acquire are important to our intelligence, personal experience, memories we build, the ability to develop things like wisdom, intuition, social skills are just as important to our intelligence. So if technology like this were to arise, it would seem that these skills would kind of be left behind. You would no longer go to school and interact with people. And a lot of these traits would maybe cease to exist. So that, to me, would seem like a step in the wrong direction. As I'm sure anyone in this room agrees, the ability to draw from your personal experience to help you make decisions, complete tasks is huge to each individual. And without that, I really don't know how positive the outcomes of this technology would be. So yeah, that's my presentation. Questions?
Yeah, so in the technology you are describing, at one point you said that there would be no limit to what you could do, but you are educating a substrate, a brain with certain, metrics, right? It's maybe faster than some brains, not as fast as others. And so if you try to train it beyond what that brain's capable of, it's not going to work. The other thing that's sort of interesting when you think about the limits here, as you point out, you can remove half the brain and things are fine. But still, the functioning of the brain behaves as if there's a physical limit, in the sense that geniuses with areas where they're much more able than the average human, that they can just do amazing things, usually also have some ordinary skill that they don't do very well. Like they can't spell, they can't sort of draw a map in their head of where they are and get back to where they came from like normal people can. And so it's intriguing to think where that comes from. It isn't like based on brain size or brain allocation, but there still are those limits. But on the one hand, I don't agree that there would be no limit. On the other hand, some of the things that you have indicated would not be teachable clearly are. I mean, you can teach somebody how to be a good friend, to be empathetic, to have good social skills, all those things. There are teaching points for how to get along with others and so on. So I know it seems like an odd thing to have a course in, but the other thing is that you're assuming that experiences cannot be transferred. You cannot transfer memories. Well, why is that? I think that you probably can. Initially, it's going to be confusing if you upload somebody else's memories. Then you're learning something through their life experience, but you may confuse it with your own memories, but the main character is different, right? It's them rather than you. And yeah, so that's something we haven't faced before. But I think when the point of this tech that you're describing comes, those things that you were saying that you really regret that we couldn't make use of life experience and social skills and wisdom and all that stuff. I don't know any reason that you couldn't. Why can't, if you value the wisdom of older people, that is also possible to sort of encapsulate and you can have a course on wisdom, and before you take that course you're clueless about the world. You take this course on wisdom, and in a couple of hours, you're a world-class philosopher who can cope with anything. So I think that it's a more complex enterprise, but the possibilities are actually substantially greater than what you were indicating. That if this actually works, then you can apply it to everything. It's not just standard school subjects. It's everything. It's life in general. If there's something you want to learn that's a part of life, you could learn it this way. And would it really matter that you had somebody who learned it over 40 years and somebody who learned it over four hours? I think in the long run, it really wouldn't. And it would, you would find that human beings are heterogeneous, and that the phrase, "my brain is full," which now only appears in cartoons and jokes and things, would become a real thing with some people, that you'd hit a limit. We don't know quite what the physical basis for that limit is, but as you try to make people with ordinary brains into people who had learned, 8 different major subjects and sort of mastered them all at the PhD level, that wouldn't really work. And it would be a new thing to face of how to kind of figure out, well, this brain that I'm going to, infuse this information into sometime, how can I figure out how much it can actually absorb? What is it capable of?
And as you said, obviously, we have no idea what that is right now.
Yeah.
So that would be something we wouldn't even have the ability to deal with until something like this did arise.
Yeah. If you think about birds, there are birds like crows that to some extent can cope with ideas as well as a 7-year-old child. They're not as cool to talk to as a 7-year-old child. A lot of things a 7-year-old child can do, they can't do. But they can understand metaphors and things, and kind of symbolic, kind of graphical IQ sort of thing. Crows are really quite capable. And there are other birds like that and yet the brain size that they're working with is so tiny, that if you think of the size of our brain, and if that same, efficiency was there, if our brain size is like 1,000 times the size of a bird brain, then if we were 1,000 times as intelligent as these crows, it would really be amazing. So there are all sorts of kind of scale questions here. What's scalable, what isn't, what are the limits that we just don't know about yet. But there are other animal species that at least raise questions about whether amazing increases in intellectual performance might not be possible. Other questions? Yep.
For the slide about ADHD and the medication, it's talking about the memory, like how they did a test on memory and how you can retain information better. Does that apply to people with ADHD, or?
No, this is dealing with like intact individuals who don't have any sort of deficit.
Oh, okay.
I'm sure it applies as well to those with ADHD, but a common belief is that these drugs don't actually aid in any sort of memory. They just allow you to focus longer. But studies from the 90s and early 2000s have shown that individuals using these drugs at the time of learning, whether they be animal models or human models, do show better results in free recall tasks, condition place preference, and a number of other memory tasks.
So how would that technology work on people with ADHD or dementia?
The
new research done?
It's already in bigger use for motor issues like stroke and paralysis, like I said. From a purely speculative point, I can't see why it wouldn't have applications in other neurological disorders. I did see a little bit of research on using it for depression, helping people mimic the brain activity of happy individuals. So I can't see why it wouldn't be useful in applications such as ADHD.
as to how, for example, like a computer drive, hard drive has a certain amount of writes, do you think that using this method of transcranial direct current stimulation, there's like a certain amount of, I guess, write cycles that we'll be able to apply to the human brain? So there's something we don't know on how much information we can, I guess, put into the brain using this method. So do you think there's, I guess, perils surrounding this technology? And by that I mean it might have, say, like an older individual which has certain deterioration in their brain and stuff. It might remove information that is present that's like important. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. So just as the process by which a synapse is potentiated, the whole process itself is called long-term potentiation. There is a parallel process called long-term depotentiation, where synapses that aren't used are weakened and then reallocated to places of more efficient use. So I think you could be right that if you had a brain that, say, had some sort of neurological deterioration or degeneration, and you were trying to pack into it and potentiate all these different synapses, and there just wasn't enough cognitive resource there to help it, I think it would be possible to see losses in areas that you didn't want to see loss.
You also talked about how they used electric signaling in the brain to help with the flight simulation. Do you think there are any like potential dangers in using this? Like if like some memories would be impaired in the individuals who got these electric shocks? Like were there any risks?
So I found a few papers that talked about risk. So currently there's a lot of, like, you can buy a TDCS machine for $200 on Amazon that literally have two electrodes, one that you place on your forehead and one that you place on your temple. And the science behind those at this point is very weak. The specificity required to have benefit is immense, and these at-home devices just don't have it. So I did find papers that showed, while using these at-home devices, a mild improvement was seen in the skill that was being learned. But then again, at the same time, mild deficits were seen in other normal areas. So with these at-home tests, there is some cause for concern with damage or losing things that you don't want to lose. But at this point, these professional machines are so specific and so little research has been done on them that I didn't really find much that the professional grade machines were any cause for concern.
Okay, I think we should go on to the next presentation. Thanks.